Hi everyone, this is Judy, your EJ Strong intern, and today I'll be walking you through the components of a capacity assessment. So unlike our disaster risk and vulnerability assessments, the capacity assessment actually includes a handful of tables that I'll be walking us through one by one. As an overview, the capacity assessment will touch on prevention and mitigation resources, as well as an assessment of the study area's survivability and readiness, both before and during a hazard event. And I'll go into what all that means in just a bit. So we can start with assessing our community's capacities for prevention and mitigation. Like before, we will be using the example of a fire event in the LAMC communities to guide this exercise. The purpose of this section is to identify any existing capacities for preventing and mitigating hazard events, and subsequently identifying any capacities our community may be missing, which can tell us about the gaps that we need to fill. So before we jump into filling out the form, let's first define prevention. So prevention is a way to impede or prevent a hazard from causing a disaster. Or in other words, prevent a disaster from occurring in the first place. So for this first part of the form, we'll list out any existing capacities our study area has in place to prevent a disaster from occurring. There are many sources for this type of information, including any publicly available information online, or through storytelling and conversations with local leaders. You can also draw on your own personal experiences for this part. Considering the area of the LAMC communities, we know that the area currently has an early warning system in place to alert residents in the event of an emergency. So we'll put that in the first box here. Moving to required capacities, we will list here any resources a community should have to prevent a fire from occurring that we either know our LAMC communities don't have, or we're unsure whether they have it or not. So for our example of an urban fire in the North Charleston area, we might think of things like a fire response plan, emergency trainings and exercises, established evacuation routes and shelters that could prevent a fire from turning into a disaster in the area. The last box in this table is gaps. And this is where we can try to identify why our community doesn't have those resources listed in the required section and what we should focus on to fill that gap. So here we can say awareness of prevention resources and involvement of community members, because there are opportunities for emergency resources to be better communicated to community members who can also create their own trainings or plans if necessary. So next we'll assess our community's mitigation resources the same way we just did for prevention. Mitigation activities are different from prevention in that they are meant to lessen or reduce the force of a hazard's impact, not necessarily avoid it altogether, like in prevention. So considering activities currently taking place in the LAMC communities that are meant to mitigate fires, we have firefighting resources. Required mitigation activities include additional firefighters, fire departments or halls, equipment, hydrants, and sprinkler systems. We can again attribute a gap in awareness of mitigation resources that needs to be addressed for the community to be more resilient to fire. So next we'll take a look at assessing capacity for survivability, which is the ability of a community to avoid loss of life during a hazard event. This part of the form starts looking at capacities before and during a hazard, since capacities that help at these two stages can be very different. We'll start by listing our human elements at risk, and to make this easy, you can just refer back to the vulnerability assessment form and pull the list of high vulnerability demographics we've already seen used in EPA's EJ Screen tool. So here we have the elderly, children, people with less than a high school education, linguistically isolated populations, people of color, and those with lower income. Next, we'll identify each of these elements' existing capacities for survivability, or things these groups currently do that could increase their survivability. Here we have protecting household items and being already present at home. We may not have existing capacities for each group, so we'll leave the rest as not applicable. The next step is to identify required capacities that each of these groups will need in order to survive a hazard. All groups have an increased need for access to evacuation centers, with elderly people additionally needing accessible and easy access, and children needing to be warned and picked up at schools in the event that a hazard occurs during school hours. So from these required capacities, we can work towards understanding gaps in survivability capacity before a hazard occurs, which boils down to means of transportation. So now we'll do the same thing for survivability, but this time we'll assess our capacities during a hazard event. So we'll keep our list of elements at risk the same. And for existing capacities, we can think of things these groups can do to increase survivability during a hazard. So here we have assistance in carrying things during an evacuation, with elderly additionally acting as decision makers for a family in an emergency event. So next, for capacities required for survivability during a hazard, all groups will need to be totally evacuated, with linguistically isolated groups requiring bilingual communication. And then for gaps, we have means of transportation, evacuation systems, and disaster education awareness. The last part of the capacity assessment is to assess readiness capacity, which includes the resources that help communities cope with hazards. So while the survivability tables we just went over were concerned with the human elements at risk, readiness is concerned with the non-human elements, which include transportation, health and medical services, early warning systems, communication, internal response, evacuation, livelihoods, organizational development and governance, provisions of food, water, and security, technology, ecosystems management and restoration, and coordination and incident command systems. So this is a big list of things, but you can use the acronym at the top, the Cielo ProTech, to help you remember. So some of these elements are lacking capacities, and we can put this down in the required section. So here we have needs for warning equipment from early warning systems, adequate employment for livelihoods, coordination between community-based organizations and local governments, utilities, and air and water quality monitoring for our ecosystems management. So this allows us to assess our gaps, which are needs for improved warning equipment and alarm systems, changes in unemployment rates, public and private partnerships with community-based organizations and government, more affordable energy and broadband availability, and environmental monitoring equipment. The last part of the capacity assessment is assessing that readiness during a hazard, in the same way we just assessed readiness before a hazard. So we'll keep the elements from the Cielo ProTech acronym and think about how our needs for these items may change during a hazard. So for required needs, we have needs for evacuation transportation, an emergency department, communications equipment, first responders and firefighters, evacuation routes, shelters, and emergency management presence. In terms of gaps and action items, we have means of transportation, availability of emergency medicine, mutual aid, communications between first responders and emergency managers, mutual aid with surrounding jurisdictions, clearly marked evacuation routes, accessible shelters, and local knowledge of emergency managers. And that is how to complete a capacity assessment form for your community. As always, reach out with any questions you may have. Thank you and see you next time.